Right now, across 3 major European countries, firefighting aircraft are in the air simultaneously. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced from their homes, and entire landscapes that took generations to grow are being reduced to blackened ash in a matter of hours. Since early July of this year, Mediterranean Europe has been locked inside one of its most severe and sustained wildfire seasons in recorded history, and as of this week, the fires have not stopped. In Spain, more than 450 square miles of land have burned in just the last 2 weeks alone, with the fire near Avila now recognized as the largest single wildfire in that country's entire recorded history. In France, the national total for burned land has already surpassed 115,000 hectares this year, a new national record, driven substantially by a single blaze in the Gironde region that ranks among the largest France has seen since the Second World War. And in Italy, more than 90,000 hectares have burned so far in 2026, a figure 57% above the 20-year average, with fires actively raging across Sicily, Sardinia, Calabria, Tuscany, and Piedmont simultaneously. The European Union has now activated its largest coordinated firefighting mobilization to date, with firefighting planes and helicopters staged across a dozen countries, and hundreds of firefighters pre-positioned and ready to deploy the moment a new blaze breaks out. This video is going to walk through exactly what's happening on the ground across all 3 countries, the specific atmospheric and ecological mechanism that turned this into such an extreme season, what climate scientists have already concluded about the role human-driven warming is playing in this specific disaster, and what the coming days and weeks realistically look like as this crisis continues to unfold across the continent. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know if you or anyone you know has been personally affected by any of this, whether that's in Spain, France, Italy, or anywhere else across the Mediterranean this summer, because this is very much still an ongoing, developing situation rather than a finished story we're looking back on. And if you want to keep tracking how this crisis develops over the coming weeks, go ahead and subscribe now, because fire danger across the region is forecast to remain elevated well into the end of August. Let's start in Spain, because the scale of what's happened there over the past month genuinely defies easy comparison to anything the country has experienced in living memory. The fires didn't arrive in isolation. They followed months of severe drought layered directly beneath a record-breaking summer heatwave sequence, exactly the kind of compounding setup that turns ordinary dry vegetation into what firefighters describe as standing fuel, essentially a landscape primed and waiting for a single spark. By late July, a fire near La Mierla in the province of Guadalajara had grown to roughly 35,000 hectares before authorities were finally able to bring it down to the lowest emergency classification. At almost exactly the same time, 3 separate fires burning to the west of Madrid, near Avila and Toledo, merged into a single unified fire front that had consumed approximately 80,000 hectares by the end of July, officially making it the worst wildfire event in the entire recorded history of the Madrid region. Within that same merged fire complex, the blaze burning specifically around Avila grew to roughly 50,000 hectares on its own, a number that, almost unbelievably, now stands as the single largest wildfire ever recorded in Spain's modern history, surpassing every previous fire the country has documented. To put those Spanish numbers into a scale that's actually easy to visualize, 80,000 hectares works out to roughly 200,000 acres, an area larger than many mid-sized American cities, combined into a single contiguous burn scar, consumed not over a season but within a matter of weeks. And this wasn't confined to one region. Wildfire smoke has been documented drifting over towns like Fermoselle, directly along Spain's border with Portugal, a visual signal of just how far and how thickly the smoke plume from these combined fires has spread across the western half of the country. Emergency services have had to coordinate evacuations across multiple provinces simultaneously, a genuinely difficult logistical challenge when your firefighting aircraft, ground crews, and emergency personnel are all being pulled in different directions by fires of comparable severity breaking out across a wide geographic front rather than being concentrated in one single area where resources can be massed and focused effectively. France's story runs in close parallel, and in some ways it's even more historically significant, because the national total burned this year has already broken the country's all-time annual record, and it's still only August. As of the most recent tally, France has passed roughly 115,000 hectares burned nationwide for the year, and the single largest contributor to that number is the fire that broke out in the Gironde region, in the country's southwest, which by late July had consumed approximately 42,000 hectares on its own, officially placing it among the largest wildfires France has experienced since the Second World War. The human displacement from that single fire alone has been staggering. More than 220,000 people were evacuated across the Gironde region as the fire advanced, with an additional roughly 30,000 evacuated from the neighboring Landes area, meaning 250,000 people in southwestern France were forced from their homes because of fires that, in some cases, started from causes as mundane as a spark from machinery or an improperly extinguished cigarette landing in vegetation that had been stripped of moisture by months of drought and heat. It's worth pausing to explain exactly why Gironde specifically has become such a recurring flashpoint for France's worst wildfires, because it's not simply bad luck, it's a specific combination of geography and vegetation that makes this region uniquely vulnerable. The area is home to the largest managed pine forest in Western Europe, the Landes Forest, a vast, densely planted commercial timber region that, while economically valuable, also creates exactly the kind of continuous, highly flammable fuel load that allows a fire to spread rapidly and with tremendous intensity once it gets started, especially once that timber has been dried out by an extended drought. This is precisely the same region that produced France's catastrophic 2022 wildfire season, and the fact that a comparably devastating fire has struck the same geographic area again just a few years later says something important about how quickly this specific landscape can return to a dangerously combustible state once drought conditions set back in, and about how little margin for error a densely planted commercial forest of this scale actually has once the moisture buffer that normally protects it disappears. It's worth briefly bringing Portugal into this picture too, even though the title of this video focuses specifically on Spain, France, and Italy, because Portugal has been fighting the exact same underlying weather pattern throughout the same period, and its numbers help illustrate just how widely this crisis has spread across the entire Iberian Peninsula, rather than staying confined to Spain alone. As of mid-August, Portugal had lost more than 63,000 hectares to wildfire this year, spread across more than 6,600 separate rural fire incidents, a pattern of frequent widespread ignition rather than one or two enormous megafires, reflecting a landscape that has become so uniformly dry that fires are breaking out in dozens of different locations simultaneously, rather than concentrating in one specific fire complex the way Spain's Avila blaze or France's Gironde fire did. Portugal has repeatedly requested and received support through the same European civil protection mechanism, now stretched thin across the entire southern half of the continent, a clear signal that no single country in the region has been spared from this year's extreme conditions, and that the crisis genuinely needs to be understood as a Mediterranean-wide event, rather than a series of coincidentally simultaneous national disasters. Now let's turn to Italy, where the wildfire crisis has taken a somewhat different shape, spreading across a wider number of distinct regions, rather than concentrating into one or two record-shattering megafires the way Spain and France have experienced. Italy has recorded more than 90,000 hectares burned so far in 2026, a total that sits 57% above the country's 20-year average. And unlike the other two countries, the fires have struck almost every part of the peninsula and its islands simultaneously, from Sicily and Sardinia in the south, through Calabria on the mainland's toe, up into Tuscany, and even as far north as Piedmont in the shadow of the Alps. Sicily in particular became a focal point of international attention when the town of Floridia recorded a temperature of 8 degrees Celsius, the highest temperature ever officially recorded anywhere on the European continent, arriving in direct combination with active, destructive wildfires burning across the island at the very same time. In Sardinia, the Monteferru fire alone burned approximately 20,000 hectares and displaced hundreds of residents, while separate figures published for the island show the scale of just how active this fire season has become there specifically, with roughly 200 individual fires recorded since the start of the year, 670 of them in June alone, a 25% increase over the island's own 10-year average. Italy's fire crisis has also carried a specific and troubling detail that sets it apart from the other two countries. A meaningful share of Italian wildfires, unusually for Europe as a whole, are believed to be deliberately set rather than accidentally sparked, a pattern authorities have documented repeatedly across multiple fire seasons in the country's south. That detail matters enormously for how you interpret a statistic like 57% above average, because it means the extreme heat and drought conditions this year haven't just made accidental ignition more likely, they've created a landscape that's also more attractive and more devastating as a target for deliberate arson, since dry, stressed vegetation catches and spreads fire far more readily and far more destructively than healthy, moisture-retaining vegetation would under normal conditions. Beyond the three regions already mentioned, farming communities across Sardinia specifically have reported catastrophic agricultural losses, with livestock, beehives, and stored animal feed destroyed across thousands of hectares of pasture and cropland, with the Regional Farming Association estimating initial losses at around 10 million euros, a figure officials expect to keep climbing steadily as the full scope of the damage gets properly assessed in the weeks ahead. It's worth stepping back at this point to explain the actual physical mechanism driving this crisis across all three countries simultaneously, because understanding it makes clear why this isn't simply three unrelated national disasters that happen to coincide by chance. It's a single underlying atmospheric and ecological process playing out in parallel across an entire region that shares the same broad Mediterranean climate. Wildfire risk fundamentally depends on what fire scientists sometimes describe using the shorthand of a fire triangle: available fuel, favorable weather, and an ignition source. Under ordinary circumstances, Mediterranean vegetation, the scrubby maquis, the pine forests, the dry summer grasslands, retains enough residual moisture even through a typical hot summer that fires that do start tend to stay relatively contained, burning through the driest surface material without necessarily consuming everything down to bare soil. This year, though, that baseline moisture buffer was already gone before the summer even properly began, because Western Europe entered 2026 already suffering from a severe extended drought, one that researchers had already been separately studying and documenting even before this wildfire season fully ignited. That drought, combined with a sequence of extreme heat waves that repeatedly pushed temperatures well above seasonal norms across the region through June and July, created a feedback loop that scientists studying this exact phenomenon have specifically flagged as central to why this year's fires have grown so much larger and so much faster than typical seasonal fires. When soil and vegetation are already critically dry heading into the hottest weeks of summer, every additional heat wave doesn't just add more heat to the air. It actively accelerates evaporation from what little moisture remains in the ground and in plant tissue, stripping away the vegetation's natural resistance to ignition even further. Scientists refer to the atmosphere's overall pull on available moisture as evaporative demand, and rising evaporative demand tied directly to global warming has been specifically identified as reinforcing and deepening the very soil moisture drought that's driving this year's fire behavior, creating a cycle where each heat wave makes the landscape measurably more flammable heading into the next one, even in years, like this one, that actually received near normal winter rainfall to begin with. There's a specific technical measurement researchers use to track exactly how much more dangerous this kind of compounding heat and drought pattern makes a given fire season, called the Fire Weather Index, and the trend data behind it is genuinely striking. Researchers analyzing decades of historical weather data have found a clear, consistent upward trend in the number of days per year classified as extreme fire weather across Western Europe specifically, with Portugal, Spain, and France, the very countries at the center of this year's crisis, showing the steepest increases of anywhere studied, gaining roughly 5 additional extreme fire weather days per decade compared to the mid-20th century baseline. That's not an abstract statistical curiosity. It's a direct, measurable expansion of the actual calendar window during which a spark, whether from lightning, machinery, a discarded cigarette, or deliberate arson, is capable of erupting into the kind of runaway, landscape-scale fire that Spain, France, and Italy have all experienced simultaneously this summer. Given how directly this connects to broader climate patterns, it's worth being specific and precise about what climate scientists have actually concluded here, rather than leaving it as a vague, generalized claim, because rigorous rapid attribution research groups have specifically studied this exact event, dispatching teams to gather data, while the fires themselves were still actively burning across the region. Researchers analyzing the compounding drivers behind this summer's fires in France and Spain directly concluded that climate change has measurably increased the likelihood of the specific combination of conditions responsible for this year's extreme fire behavior, tying the finding directly to the same evaporative demand mechanism just described, where warming-driven soil moisture depletion continues intensifying wildfire risk, even in years that don't start out unusually dry from a rainfall perspective alone. This is precisely the kind of careful, conditional scientific language that separates legitimate climate attribution research from casual, unsupported claims thrown around on social media whenever a disaster like this makes headlines. The researchers aren't claiming climate change directly ignited any specific fire. That's simply not how attribution science works. What they're demonstrating instead is that the underlying atmospheric conditions, the drought severity, the heat intensity, the record-breaking evaporative demand pulling moisture out of the landscape have become measurably more likely and more severe, specifically because of the warming that's already occurred. And that shift in baseline conditions is what's translating directly into fires of this unprecedented scale. It's worth being equally clear about what this kind of research does not claim, since overstating a finding is just as damaging to public understanding as dismissing one entirely. The study does not assert that every single individual fire across Spain and France this summer was somehow caused by climate change in a direct, one-to-one sense. Ignition still requires a specific spark, whether from lightning, machinery, or human action, and attribution scientists are careful to keep that distinction explicit, even while demonstrating, with real statistical rigor, that the broader environment those sparks landed in has become dramatically more conducive to catastrophic fire spread than it would have been in a cooler pre-industrial climate. It's worth taking a moment to explain what actually happens on the ground and in the air when a firefighting response of this scale gets mobilized, because the coordination involved is genuinely more sophisticated than most people picture when they imagine a wildfire response. Large firefighting aircraft, whether the amphibious Canadair-style water bombers that skim across lakes and coastlines to refill their tanks in under a minute, or the larger fixed-wing air tankers that drop specially formulated fire retardant rather than plain water, work in close coordination with ground crews rather than operating independently. The aircraft's job generally isn't to extinguish a fire outright. That's rarely possible. Once a blaze has grown to the scale seen in Avila or Drought this year, it's to slow the fire's advance and cool its leading edge enough that ground crews, working with hand tools, bulldozers cutting fire breaks and hose lines, can actually get close enough to establish containment lines without being overrun. This is precisely why a fire's rate of spread, driven by exactly the wind, heat, and dryness conditions we've already discussed, matters so enormously to how effective any given firefighting response can actually be. A fire spreading through dense, tinder-dry vegetation, pushed by strong, hot winds, can outpace even a well-resourced aerial response, which is exactly the dynamic that allowed fires in Spain and France to grow to record-shattering size within the space of just a few weeks, despite the presence of substantial firefighting resources working to contain them from the very beginning. Let's talk about the actual firefighting response, because the scale of the coordinated effort underway right now is itself a genuinely significant part of this story, and it tells you something important about how seriously European emergency services are treating a season of this severity. Through the European Union's civil protection mechanism, member states have been able to request and receive mutual aid from neighboring countries whenever their own domestic firefighting resources become overwhelmed. And this year, that system has been stretched about as far as it's ever been stretched. The EU's dedicated RESC-EU firefighting fleet, a reserve of aircraft specifically maintained for exactly this kind of continent-wide emergency, currently has 22 firefighting planes and 5 helicopters on standby, positioned across 12 different countries, alongside 777 pre-positioned firefighters, ready for rapid deployment, the largest mobilization the program has assembled since it was established. That scale of coordinated cross-border response reflects a genuinely difficult operational reality. When Spain, France, and Italy are all simultaneously battling major, resource-intensive fires at the same time, no single country's domestic firefighting capacity, however well equipped, can realistically handle that kind of sustained multi-front demand entirely on its own, which is exactly the scenario this RESC-EU system was specifically designed to address. It's also worth understanding how European authorities track and communicate fire danger in the first place, because the system underlying most of the specific figures cited throughout this video, the European Forest Fire Information System, known as EFIS and its parent monitoring framework, the Copernicus Emergency Management Service, represents one of the more sophisticated pieces of environmental monitoring infrastructure operating anywhere in the world. These systems combine satellite observation, ground-based weather station data, and standardized fire danger modeling to produce daily forecasts of fire risk across the entire European continent, published in a publicly accessible format, specifically so that national authorities, emergency planners, and ordinary residents can all reference the same consistent, scientifically grounded risk assessment, rather than relying on fragmented, inconsistent national reporting systems. According to the most recent fire danger forecast issued by this monitoring framework, covering the period from August 20th through the 26th, very extreme fire danger conditions are currently centered specifically over Romania and Hungary, along with a separate zone over northeastern Africa, while extreme danger conditions extend south of Ireland and across central southern Italy, spreading further into the wider Balkans region, Ukraine, and Russia, with high danger surrounding those zones even further outward. That forecast matters directly to the story we've been telling, because it confirms that even as firefighters continue working to contain the specific blazes already burning across Spain, France, and Italy, the underlying atmospheric conditions driving this entire season haven't meaningfully eased, and in fact, the zone of most extreme risk appears to be actively shifting and expanding eastward across the continent, even as this video is being made. That eastward shift is worth sitting with for a moment, because it speaks directly to why the story isn't close to over. Since August 10th specifically, wildfire activity has notably intensified across southeastern Europe, with the same extreme dry conditions that devastated the Iberian Peninsula and southern France earlier in the summer now fueling a fresh wave of new fire ignitions further east. This pattern, of a severe wildfire season migrating progressively eastward across the continent as the summer wears on, is not itself unprecedented. Mediterranean fire seasons often do shift geographically as different regions experience their own peak periods of heat and dryness at slightly different points across June, July, and August, but the sheer scale and persistence of this particular season, following what was already one of the most extreme and prolonged heat wave sequences the continent has documented, means that persistence carries real weight. Authorities have explicitly warned that elevated wildfire danger could continue across the region well through the remainder of August. And based on the current fire danger forecast extending into the final week of the month, there's no clear indication yet that this crisis is approaching its conclusion. It's worth addressing something directly here that tends to get lost in the more sensationalized corners of coverage whenever a disaster of this scale unfolds across multiple countries at once, because getting the actual scale of human cost right matters, both for accuracy and for genuinely understanding what's at stake. The overwhelming majority of the damage from this year's fires has fallen into the category of property, agricultural, and ecological destruction, rather than direct loss of life on the scale seen in some previous severe European fire seasons. Though the human toll has still been real and, in some specific incidents, genuinely tragic, including firefighters suffering medical emergencies while battling blazes under extreme heat and physical exertion, and residents in several affected communities losing homes and livelihoods that, in the case of farmland and centuries-old olive groves or vineyards, cannot simply be rebuilt or replanted on any short timeline. What has been genuinely unprecedented this year is the sheer geographic scale and the speed at which these fires grew. The fact that a single fire complex could expand to become the largest ever recorded in an entire country's history within the space of just a few weeks. And the fact that Spain, France, and Italy were all simultaneously experiencing fires of genuinely historic severity within the very same summer season, rather than one country having a uniquely bad year while its neighbors experienced something closer to normal. So, what does all of this actually mean going forward? And what should you actually take away from this story if you're following it, either out of general concern or because you have direct connections to any of the affected regions? First, understand that this remains a genuinely active, ongoing situation rather than a completed disaster being assessed in hindsight, with the current fire danger forecast specifically extending elevated risk through the end of August and showing that risk actively shifting towards southeastern Europe, even as firefighting crews continue working around the clock to fully contain the fires already burning across Spain, France, and Italy. Second, if you have travel plans to any of the affected regions in the coming weeks, the most useful practical step is to check official government travel advisories and regional civil protection bulletins directly rather than relying on secondhand reports, since containment status genuinely varies significantly from one specific fire in one specific region to the next, and conditions on the ground can shift rapidly as wind patterns change, sometimes within the span of a single afternoon. Third, understand that the smoke from fires of this scale travels far beyond the immediate burn area, as demonstrated by smoke plumes documented drifting across international borders between Spain and Portugal, meaning air quality concerns from a fire genuinely can, and often do, extend to areas well outside the specific zones under evacuation orders, which is worth factoring in if you or someone you know has respiratory sensitivities and lives anywhere within the broader Mediterranean region this summer, since fine particulate smoke can travel hundreds of kilometers and remain a genuine health hazard long after it's no longer visible as a distinct plume in the sky. Fourth, if you want to actually track how the situation develops in as close to real time as the general public reasonably can, the European Forest Fire Information System publishes daily updated fire danger forecasts and active fire data that are freely accessible to anyone, offering a considerably more precise and current picture than most general news coverage is able to provide on any given day. Fifth, and this applies specifically to anyone living within or near the affected regions, rather than simply following the story from afar, it's worth having a basic evacuation plan in place before conditions in your specific area ever escalate to the point where local authorities issue a formal order, since the speed at which some of this year's largest fires expanded, tens of thousands of hectares within a matter of days in several documented cases, left remarkably little margin between a fire first being reported nearby and residents needing to leave immediately. A pattern regional civil protection agencies across Spain, France, and Italy have all specifically highlighted when urging residents in fire-prone areas to identify their evacuation routes and gather essential documents and medications well in advance of any specific threat actually materializing. Zooming out, it's worth situating this specific wildfire crisis within the broader pattern of extreme weather that's defined 2026 as a whole, because it doesn't exist in isolation from everything else this year has already produced. The same record-breaking heatwave sequence that struck Europe earlier this summer, the one that pushed France to its hottest June day on record and drove more than 1,000 excess deaths in a single week, is directly connected to the drought and soil moisture depletion now fueling this wildfire crisis, since it's the same underlying atmospheric pattern, the same persistent high-pressure blocking systems, and the same rising evaporative demand driving both disasters. This is precisely the kind of compounding, cascading climate pattern that researchers have increasingly warned about in recent years, where a single season's extreme heat doesn't simply pass through and disappear once temperatures eventually moderate. It leaves behind a landscape that's been fundamentally primed for the next disaster, whether that's the kind of catastrophic wildfire outbreak currently burning across 3 major European countries, or the kind of flash flooding and infrastructure strain that tends to follow once autumn rains finally do arrive on ground that spent months critically dry and, in many of the worst affected areas, has now also lost much of its vegetation cover entirely to fire, stripping away one of the landscape's own natural defenses against the erosion and flooding that so often follows a severe fire season once the rains eventually return. There's also a longer-term ecological dimension worth understanding here, because the consequences of a wildfire season this severe don't end the moment the last flame is extinguished. Mediterranean forests and scrubland have, over thousands of years, developed a degree of natural resilience to fire. Many native plant species have evolved specific adaptations: thick bark, seed pods that only open under intense heat, root systems capable of resprouting after a burn that allow the landscape to eventually recover from a fire of moderate size and intensity. But that resilience has real limits, and fires of the scale recorded in Spain and France this year, burning tens of thousands of hectares in a single continuous event at high intensity, can push affected ecosystems past the threshold where that natural recovery process still functions the way it has for centuries. Severe, high-intensity fires can sterilize topsoil, destroy the seed banks that would otherwise allow native vegetation to regenerate, and leave slopes stripped bare and dramatically more vulnerable to catastrophic erosion and landslides once rain eventually returns, sometimes for years afterward. Researchers who study post-fire landscapes specifically watch for a follow-on hazard that rarely makes headlines the way the original fire does. A barren, denuded hillside that has lost its root structure loses much of its ability to hold soil in place, meaning a rainfall event that would have been entirely unremarkable on healthy, vegetated terrain can instead trigger dangerous flash flooding and debris flows on the very same slopes that burned only months earlier. A genuinely cruel irony where this summer's fire disaster quietly sets up the conditions for a flood disaster later in the same year. If you found this breakdown useful for understanding the actual scale and mechanism behind what's happening across Spain, France, and Italy right now, give this video a like, since it genuinely helps this kind of grounded, sourced explanation reach more people who might otherwise only be seeing fragmented single-country coverage of what is actually one connected continent-wide story. Drop a comment and let me know if you've been personally affected by any of this, whether through evacuation, smoke, travel disruption, or simply watching the news from somewhere else in Europe with genuine concern. Because hearing directly from people connected to these specific regions adds a dimension to this story that official statistics alone can't fully capture. And subscribe if you want to keep following this crisis as it continues developing, because based on the most current fire danger forecasts available, this wildfire season is not yet finished, and the coming weeks will likely determine whether the historic totals already recorded in Spain, France, and Italy climb even higher before this Mediterranean fire season is finally brought under control.